Hi all, thank you for coming to the internal cycle of seminars. Well, today Mary Kane is going to present part of her work here. She is a member of the Amphibio group, Physical and Biological Interactions in the Ocean, and she's a Marie Curie postdoc since April 2021. And today is going to do a presentation about phytoplankton blooms that appear or occur in the seashores near to some beaches, specifically I think to Cala Santanyí.
No, Palma.
No? Palma today?
Palma this time.
Okay, perfect. So thank you and let's go.
Right, so I'm presenting on the formation of summer phytoplankton blooms near beaches in Mallorca. So some of this work is from a project where I've been involved more in the analysis portion than in the collecting of the data. So phytoplankton are ubiquitous throughout the ocean, and there are lots of different types of phytoplankton. These are some images from actually here in Mallorca, some phytoplankton, which we were able to pass through a flow cam. And as you can see, we've got lots of different types. So we've got diatoms, dinoflagellates, phototrophic protists, other things. One of the things that phytoplankton do is they form what we call blooms. So phytoplankton blooms are massive increases in phytoplankton biomass to the point where they can discolor the water. These are generally caused by two processes, either growth, where phytoplankton are doubling in size and are able to grow massively and double about every other day, or physical processes where they are pushed to different regions. This is a satellite image from the North Atlantic spring bloom, which is one of the largest blooms you can see in space. And this is actually, you can kind of see an example of both. So the North Atlantic spring bloom does occur because of an increase in insolation and a lack of storms, so they are actually growing in size. But you can also see in these swirling eddies the physical processes. So the ocean is literally pushing the phytoplankton into particular regions. A subset of phytoplankton blooms are called harmful algal blooms. So these are algal blooms which cause problems, be they environmental and ecological. They kill off a lot of fish. They prevent light from getting down to benthic plants. They do other things. Economic, where they disrupt some sort of activity, usually either aquaculture or here in Mallorca, tourism, because who likes to go to a beach where the water is basically brown? Or health problems where it actually is toxic. So they actually can produce toxins in some cases, which, I mean, you get shellfish poisoning a good portion of the time that's caused actually by toxins produced by phytoplankton. And the relevant culture thing is, if you've ever heard of Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, this was actually inspired by an event in Capitola from the 1950s, where the seagulls probably ate some very toxic anchovies and then attack people. So it messes with your head. So it's not good. And harmful algal blooms have in fact been increasing in frequency for the last 50 years. So not necessarily the duration, but the constant occurrence. So here in the Mediterranean, and specifically in Mallorca, the blooms occur very near shore, usually in summer. So you can go out to a beach one day and it's perfectly clear and everything else, and then the next day it can look like that. So it's, and these blooms are really close to shore. This is from Cala Santanyí. This is a picture taken from a prop plane, and you can see the green discoloration doesn't go very far offshore. It is really close to the beach. And so the SIFOMED project, which is funded by the Spanish government, was looking at the circulation induced by the thermal and haline siphon and its influence on the dynamics. So what physical abiotic factors influence phytoplankton blooms near the shore here in Mallorca. So this project was conducted from 18th through the 25th of July, 2018 at Palma Beach. And this was done along a transect where they had 600 meters offshore. And what they did was they would actually do boat sampling about every 3 hours to collect at the points, which you can see in the triangles on the upper thing and the points on the satellite image. And there are also some moorings for continuous sampling of physical data. They are marked M1, M2, and M3, with M1 being the furthest offshore and M3 being the closest onshore. So for all of this, with the numbers for sample points, the lower the number, the further offshore it is, the higher the number, the closer onshore it is. There is also a weather buoy located 3.5 kilometers offshore to collect information on wind speed and direction. And then the goal of my analysis of this data was to compare wind, salinity, chlorophyll, and nutrients over time to see what factors were influencing the blooms. So wind, we found, is, and this is actually well known, wind direction and intensity is tied directly to increasing temperature here. It's tied to the increasing insolation, so land heats up faster than water. And here in Mallorca, what happens is when the onshore breeze, the wind starts moving, when the land temperature reaches 5 degrees higher than the sea surface temperature. It's a well-known phenomenon, and at that point, you just get very strong winds blowing onshore. You can see here, this is actually based on time of day, but you can see the wind gets really strong during the day, but it's not as strong at night. So there's a lot of push onto the shore, not so much off the shore. And the wind movement does influence the water surface currents. And so the idea is that the wind pushes the water and also the phytoplankton in the water onto the shore. So part of what the blooms we're seeing is actually caused by the fact that the plankton don't have as much room to move, so they're getting compressed into these shallower depths. And again, the wind doesn't move very far at night, so there's just a continuous buildup. So the net movement of the wind and the water is to the shore, not away from. So here in Mallorca, the rock is relatively porous, which allows for the rainwater to get underneath the island, and also means that we have a large quantity of submarine groundwater seepage throughout the island. It averages about 10.3 centimeters per day, but it can go as high as 65 centimeters per day, leaching out into the ocean. And the groundwater seepage in all of Palma Bay is estimated to be about 56,000 meters cubed per day. So a lot of water can potentially leak out from under the island and into the ocean and influence these regions. And what it does is it produces these regions of lower saline water. So fresh water plus seawater produces areas of lower salinity. And then also it brings in nutrients from under the rocks and also from eutrophication due to agriculture. And it produces these areas, again, of lower saline, higher nutrient content, which is attracted to some phytoplankton because some of the predators of phytoplankton don't like lower saline areas, and also more nutrients means they have more of an ability to grow. So in total, we've got the wind movement pushing the water, water and plankton towards the shore, and we've got the submarine groundwater bringing nutrients and lower salinity, which provides these optimal regions for phytoplankton to become more abundant. And then if we look at the analysis, we can actually see that the phytoplankton, this is a CCA analysis, and the phytoplankton have a stronger correlation to the wind. So the wind is really driving a lot of the phytoplankton abundance. And we also know this is primarily physical forcing and not a growth bloom, because when we look at gross primary production to cellular respiration rate, so how fast are they growing versus how much energy are they utilizing, between onshore and offshore, it's actually relatively similar. This is offshore, not solely offshore, but it's within Palma Bay, it's relatively similar. So they're not growing any faster further offshore than they really are onshore. So phytoplankton abundances here change drastically day to day. It's largely a physical forced system based on winds and currents. And so increased temperature and the formation of strong onshore breezes is what primarily drives these blooms by pushing the water and the plankton towards the shore, and then the plankton prefer to stay in these regions with higher nutrients. Because the submarine groundwater discharge creates these areas of lower salinity and higher nutrient availability. And also, high abundances of phytoplankton will attract more predators, so eventually you do get some more predators who can tolerate the lower salinity, but they also result in higher rates of infections of things like viruses, bacteria, and parasitoids, which is the research I'm doing here. So parasitoids are a type of dinoflagellate that's only about 2 micrometers long, and the life cycle is such that what it does is a single individual zooid will actually infect a dinoflagellate and bore into it, and then basically consume its innards, so think aliens, and then produces sporangia, which is the reproductive. So at some point it will actually break out of the shell of a dinoflagellate. It produces these round balls, which we call sporangia, and then multiplies like crazy inside of them before it finally gets mature enough that it releases. And a lot of parasitoids that we know of here in the Mediterranean are generalist species, so they will infect a large number of different dinoflagellate species. So they're not usually only related to one, they're related to a whole series, which means that for harmful algal blooms produced by different types of dinoflagellates, we may actually have, they can utilize them to grow their own populations. So I've been doing research at Cala Santanyí, and this is a tourist beach on the south side of Mallorca with several hotels and restaurants. And it's popular with tourists, but it does experience harmful algal blooms very consistently. Every year, there's usually at least one bloom in summer that lasts 3 to 4 weeks. And so part of the goal of the research here is to see, do we see these parasitoids very often? And we've seen, and for the last 2 summers, the primary cause of the blooms have been caused by this dinoflagellate species, which is Gymnodinium littoralis. And we've also seen the parasitoids present here. So part of what I'm currently working on is understanding the dynamics between parasitoids and the dinoflagellates, as well as understanding the phytoplankton community at Cala Santanyí for the last 16 months. So, questions?
It's just curiosity. Also, the bloom here in Cala Santanyí is caused by physical forcing and underground waters.
I think so, yes. These blooms have a tendency to form when the water is very flat and the winds are very strong onshore. Once we get a current into that cala, it washes everything out. So I do think part of it is physical forcings. I think there is some growth though, so I do have to do some analysis of my own data.
I would like to ask, just out of curiosity too, does the dinoflagellate have any defense mechanism against these parasitoids, or once they are together, it's the end of dinoflagellate?
They do actually. This is actually from a video. It's a screenshot from a video. The video's on my computer, and I can show you later. But what it does is it actually will try and twist around to prevent the zooid from burrowing into it. If it succeeds, that's great, but sometimes it doesn't. Other species probably have thicker shells, so there are some dinoflagellates that actually do have shells, and that may prevent some level of parasitism. While the parasitoids are generalists, there are some strains of different dinoflagellates that are more resistant to the parasitoids, so it varies.
And given the fact that they are generalist parasites, have you considered the possibility of using them to release them on when you have a bloom to reduce the time?
That's what my research is on, is to evaluate whether or not we can do this. So.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Does the sea currents have is a physical forcing, relevant forcing here or not?
I'm still working on that bit. My understanding is yes. In Cala Santanyí for sure, if it's flat, we don't get, the bloom develops and then it takes a while, but once we get a good storm, it washes it out. With the Palma Beach, it does look like the currents, so there is some current forcing where it does seem that if the currents are higher, which is these regions, if there's more movement, it's actually in the opposite of the chlorophyll. So it does seem that the more currents there are, the more the phytoplankton gets washed out. But I'm still working on the analysis for that.
Because I know that's a factor, a huge factor in the Atlantic Ocean, for example, but by the oligotrophic nature of the Mediterranean Sea, maybe it has a less important impact. I don't know.
I don't know. Maybe. It's a good thing to think of.
Very nice. How many species of parasitoids and dinoflagellates do you have in your community?
For the lab portion, we only have one species of each right now that we're working with. In terms of the community structure, we would need to do DNA analysis, which we haven't done yet. So,
okay.
But we have lots of different dinoflagellate species. I'm just not sure about the parasitoids. But Gymnodinium littoralis is the one that dominated for the blooms for the last few years. But we do get a good series of dinoflagellate species. So.
And how do you, because I'm very interested in how interactions occur at the community level, how the
they change, the species change the interactions, and so how are you going to study this? Because you said you're planning to study interactions between the
So,
parasitoids and the dinoflagellates.
so the Cala Santanyí portion of the project is the population scale. So looking at things from the overbroadening, do we see a lot of parasitoids with dinoflagellates? How does that work? Is it species specific with the dinoflagellates? Can we do it species specific with the parasitoids? The second portion of my postdoc here is to actually work on laboratory experiments, which I would like to expand to more than interactions between one species, but understand it on an individual mechanistic basis, so that way we can scale it up to populations using models to see how do these interactions work.
Have you considered to use network analysis to study the interactions between parasitoids and?
I have not.
I mean, you will need to have them identified, and you need to do some genetic analysis, you said? Because
Okay.
you don't have this information yet, right?
No.
But you will?
I think so, yeah, we're working.
Because that will be very interesting, because if you say that they have a generalist behavior, that means that they can change. So they may behave differently on how they contact or interact to other species depending on the conditions and the structure of the whole community and the variation of the different populations, etc. So that would be very cool.
Yeah, actually, the infection rates in the different species it varies. So that actually, in some ways, it modulates the populations that actually bloom, and probably because they are released for some pressure, and from others that are more sensitive for those parasitoids. But one of the things she's studying actually is that the infection process itself, which is not very well known. I mean, we know how that happens in laboratory cultures, and indeed, if you put those parasitoids in a culture in a laboratory, it will kill all the algae. But indeed, in the natural environment, it does not occur like that. There is a certain infection rate, but it doesn't just eliminate all the population. So there are other factors, either physical or either competitive between other species.
Exactly. That's I like this because I work with this. So, so there are abiotic factors, but there is also the community. So when you don't have specific interactions, then the community can make a real change. So it's not only about the species that you are focusing, but what happened with the others in the community. So that's very cool. And if you have the abundance and the identities of different species, then you could do some analysis in this sense.
Actually, this process has a lot of similarities with land crops, with and the pests in land crops. And indeed, the approach that May was doing is trying to control those blooms with those parasitoids, either grown in laboratory or in other cultures, is actually taken from agricultural control of pests. So maybe you can do that.
Cool.
So you were saying that rain and water sewage contributed to the blooms, and also, but you have them also in summer. So is there some sort of seasonality in these coastal blooms?
There is. Summer seems to be when the blooms occur more frequently. They can occur outside of that, but part of it's also due to insolation, so the amount of sun. When there's more sun, there's just more phytoplankton in the water, which allows it to then get into these conditions to form blooms. And also, the sea breeze that happens generally only happens for a certain period of the year, and that is usually in the summer. Other than that, the sea breeze, wind conditions get a little bit more chaotic.
Thank you for your presentation. It's not my field at all, but I wonder if there are some relation with the concentration of nitrates in water and other inland pollutants that could be arrived from the discharged groundwater.
Relation between nitrates and groundwater?
Yeah, because if there is a seasonality in mostly in summer, there are a lot of people in these hotels. So
Mhm.
there are more increase of leakage of the sewage system that arrives to the groundwater and then finally arrives to the coastline. I don't know if you see some relation with nitrates or E. coli or something like that with the ground of these.
We didn't see a relationship with this data between the nitrates and the phytoplankton. There is some relationship, but it's not as strong as the wind the wind is the dominant force here. We do see here the nitrates are the last 3 points on this, and you can see there's an opposite correlation. So the more phytoplankton there is, the less nitrates. So they are using some of the nitrates up. But that, again, that wasn't the driving force in the short-term period of these blooms. It's mostly the wind was dominating this one.
Yeah, because there are now the groundwater community finds that there is a kind of relationship with the groundwater discharge with the wind. So the most wind, the most discharge you will have.
Okay.
So it could be that.
It could be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, in this,
just a curiosity, how do you know where there are like freshwater discharge around the island, or like do you have a map or whatever?
Baxter Bastaraccia et al. 2010 is where they did a lot of measurements all over the island with the groundwater and finding.
And do you think that this is going to change? Is changing depending on the rain or whatever? Like,
yeah, I mean, there is fresh water almost everywhere. I mean, along the coast. That doesn't mean that the amount is huge. That depends on the geology of the area. It depends on the structure of the coastal aquifers. It depends if it's a fracture aquifer or if it's just a sedimentary aquifer. So you can assume that almost in any, I mean, here is the islands are carbonated structures, so it's very far from you can think of the island as a sponge that you are just dripping water, and that water is actually flushing out at a certain rate. Probably you know much more about this than it may sound, but Rodman is a specialist on that. But the rate may be outspaced anyway, because depending on the transmissivity of the aquifer, the discharge can be instantaneous or can be delayed for more time. For example, in some areas it has been seen, not here in Mallorca because we don't have stations that level, but let's say, for example, there is a coping between winter rain time and summer discharges, etc., because it takes like 6 months to arrive the water to the coastal area. So there is a relation between discharges, but it's not instantaneous necessarily. Not only with rain, there is also discharge also varies with sea level variations. For example, tides or variation between because of atmospheric pressure variations. So we only have a better understanding of how those things fluctuate, because one of the things that at least I learned during those samples is that it's very site-specific, the discharge, because of the geological structure. It's not very homogeneous. So sometimes the transmissivity is very rapid and sometimes it's very slow.
so do you think it would be helpful for this kind of analysis to monitor somehow like this discharge or update this?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, always knowing which kind of processes regulating the discharge is important. Nevertheless, what we see here in those blooms is basically short-term variability, and short-term variability is mainly driven by physical processes, because phytoplankton grows at 0.5 per day, doubles 1.5, twice a day. And here you are seeing very rapidly varying processes. You see the beach is brown during midday, then in the afternoon it's not. And then that's basically physical, the biology doesn't run that fast.
You have a question?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, you introduced a parameter like in the SIFOMED,
Okay.
which was about growth rate. I think the slide just after the principal component analysis. Okay. What is this number that you introduced, which is 2 near the coast and 1.7?
So these are the gross primary production to cellular respiration per individual cell. So it's basically looking at how fast is it growing versus how much energy is it utilizing. Respiration is used as a proxy for how much carbon are you consuming. Growth is how much are you producing. And so you can see these numbers are relatively similar.
Okay, what does it tell you in terms of
There isn't much growth difference between further onshore and further offshore. So even though we're getting a lot more phytoplankton further onshore, they're not growing any faster really than the guys offshore.
I mean, so would it be different to calculating just the growth rate? I mean, just.
I have that. I just thought I'd throw this number.
Yeah, I was just trying to understand. Yeah, okay.
Yes. Do you have an idea why is the gyrodinium that is usually responsible for seems to be responsible for the consistently for the
I don't know why it's specifically that species.
No, but because I was thinking maybe going back to what Amparo was saying, right? Maybe if you have a generalist and somehow then gyrodinium by has a slightly different interaction with the parasitoid, and therefore maybe it can take over and something along those lines. Can it be something that makes sense or no?
It could be. It could be that the parasitoids favor other species and not necessarily gymnodinium. I have to look at the data a little bit more. I'm working on analyzing community structure plus everything else, but the species is what dominates and has for most of the summers, or for at least the last two. I don't know about previous, but for the last 2 summers, gymnodinium seems to be the one that can access the nutrients faster or whatever it's doing. So there are other species of dinoflagellates present. It's just gymnodinium for some reason grows faster or is more present. So.
Does blooms occur in the last few years, or it's
from what in Cala Santanyí?
Yeah, is it a new phenomenon or?
It's not a new phenomenon, from my understanding from conversations with other people and locals. It starts at this point in the Cala and moves that way. And it's happened for at least the last 5 years and possibly even the last 20. And the locals do blame the hotels for it.
More or less true.
I don't know. So, we did collect seawater samples to do nutrient studies, so we're working on that.
Do you have any idea about the effects of waves?
In Cala Santanyí or in Palma? In general. Yeah, the waves do actually influence. If the waves are relatively large, you need a relatively flat sea for these blooms to occur. The more wave action there is, the more beaches and calas can get washed out, so the less the phytoplankton can accumulate. So the stronger current is, and this is borne out with the with this data again, because you can see the chlorophyll's here, and then the currents are these sections, and you can it's on the opposite side of the chlorophyll. So the stronger the currents are, the less chlorophyll there is.
Okay, so maybe we can leave it here and keep discussing now with some beers after. Thank you very much.